Hello, this is Kevin Padula, creator and host of The Story of Rhode Island. In this next installment of in-person interviews, I had the honor of sitting down with Dr. Patrick Conley, historian and author of one of my favorite Rhode Island history books, Democracy in Decline. I'm not going to lie, this was a big win for me. I've been reading Dr. Conley's work since I started researching for the podcast back in 2022, and I've had a deep respect for his understanding of Rhode Island's political history ever since. As luck would have it, a member of his family came across my review of Democracy in Decline, shared it with Dr. Conley, and soon after, I had the chance to set up this conversation. Dr. Conley welcomed me into his office with open arms, graciously donated several Rhode Island history books to my collection, even threw in a map, and most importantly, spent over an hour discussing a topic that I find truly fascinating: the history of democracy in Rhode Island. We explored how radical Rhode Island's democracy once was, how that changed dramatically in the 19th century, and we even tackled some bigger questions that I often find myself pondering. Things like, was Dorr's belief that ultimate political power rests with the people, not the state legislature, actually sustainable? Were the people of Rhode Island justified in creating the People's Constitution of 1841 without legislative approval? And should Thomas Wilson Dorr, a man who ultimately took up arms against his own state, be remembered as a hero? Dr. Conley answered all of these questions honestly and openly, and I have to say, I found myself agreeing with much of what he said. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, so please share those in the comments below. Also, let me know if there are any other Rhode Island historians or scholars you think I should speak to. Thank you, and enjoy the conversation. Dr. Conley, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today and be on The Story of Rhode Island.
My pleasure, Kevin.
Super excited for the conversation. Before we jump into it, because there's a lot I want to cover, do you mind telling my listeners a little bit about yourself and how it's enabled you to become such an expert in Rhode Island's democratic history?
All right, well, a little about myself. I was raised in South Providence, kind of along the railroad tracks there. I was on the wrong side of those tracks. My home has now been erased by the southbound lane of I-95. I went to St. Michael's Grammar School. My family were devout Catholics, and I graduated in 1952. I was actually the class president, even though I was the youngest member of that graduating class, and I went from there to LaSalle Academy. The LaSalle Academy experience probably was the most disjointed of my life, because I was the youngest person in my class at LaSalle when I came there as a sophomore. And I don't know whether it was to gain some type of attention or going through the terrible early teens or whatever the case may be. But I was very fortunate that the Christian Brothers did not expel me. They used to say that they kept me rather than expelling me and sending me to Central High, because they saw some promise. Evidently the promise was good, because a couple of years ago they put me into the LaSalle Academy Hall of Fame. Nice. And I kind of recollected in my acceptance remarks how I was lucky to have even graduated. I didn't even graduate with honors, and I was quite a good amateur athlete, and one of the sports was baseball, and I was thinking of going into a career in baseball. Perhaps I'd never expected to make the majors, but to play in the Class C or Class B baseball leagues. And that was my intention upon graduating from LaSalle. And I was also playing on a state championship baseball team out of South Providence at the time. But some of the individuals from South Providence, older guys who were playing high up in the minor leagues, they scouted me at the request of my uncle. They said he's got tremendous speed, a great arm, but there's something wrong when he got a hitch in his swing. And of course, it was because I was blind in my right eye. Didn't know the depth perception issue then. And he'd be better off if he continued in school. So my Uncle Tom who was a Grand Knight of the Knights of Columbus, St. Paul's Council, called Providence College just out of the cold from his ice cream parlor there at Thurbers Avenue in South Providence, and talked to a priest and said, I'd like you to meet my nephew. I like him, and he, more than that, he would like to enroll at Providence College. And question, well, did he apply? No. Did he take the college entrance exam? No. And I said, well, why don't you bring his record from LaSalle, where you say he's just graduated, and we'll have a look at it. And so I went up there, and the individual that we met with was Father Vincent Dorr, an outstanding baseball player at PC back in the early 20s. He eventually would become president of Providence College. And so he interviewed me, and he looked at my LaSalle record, and I said, gee, you got 98 in geometry, and 97 in biology, and 100 in English, and you got 70 in history, and 70 in French. Why the disparity? I said, well, I was kind of an upstart there, and I was sent out of the room because I was so disruptive, and I had to take mandatory 70s in those courses. He said, oh, he says, have you grown up a little? I said, oh, yes, I have, Father. You let me into Providence College. I said, no more disruptions. I'll be a good student. So he said, well, let's find a major for you. He says, pretty good in geometry. Oh yes, I am good in geometry and math, Father. And biology, well, maybe science. Well, yes, I'm pretty good there too, Father. He said, what about history? I said, history, oh, I love history. He said, good, you're a history major. Huh. And that's how I became a history major at an interview for a wayward student applying at the end of August to get into college in the following week without even a college entrance exam or an application. And so he accepted me, and I became a history major at Providence College. So if you want to know how I entered the field, I loved history, but I mean, it was funny because at LaSalle there was a Mr. Nocera, and he couldn't control the classes very well, and he was one of the individuals that put me out and had, if you look at my high school record, it shows in 1 year a 70 in history, barely passing. So that's it. And then I, of course, finished up at Providence College, and Father Foster, who was my mentor there, thought that I should go on. And once again, I repeated the stupidity by not even applying to graduate school. And so he said, where are you going? I said, well, you haven't applied. It's June. You just graduated and you don't know where you're going? Where would you like to go? I said, well, if I went anywhere, University of Notre Dame, Father. Oh, he said, oh, that's a tough one. He said, however, there's a Dominican priest out there that teaches theology. I'll call him and see what we can do. So he called and built me up to the sky, and they sent me by special delivery about a week later, application form, and also a student aid form. I filled them out, sent them back special delivery. A week after that, I was accepted as a university scholar in the Department of History in the University of Notre Dame.
Jeez.
And then after that, I realized, let's straighten out. So I ended up getting a master's degree, and they got married. I taught a year at LaSalle, and then went back for the doctorate. But then it was all serious, and I actually did my doctoral courses with a straight 6, which is 96 to 100. They were in a numerical grade. 5 was 90 to 94, and I had a straight 6 or summa cum laude, and got the doctorate as well as the master's from Notre Dame. Although it took me a few years to do the doctorate, to do the doctoral dissertation, because I had gotten married, and in my first 5 years of marriage, I had 4 children. Wow. I was working 3 jobs. I was working a construction job with my father. I had a political job with the State Constitutional Convention. And of course, I was teaching in the day school, the graduate school, and the night school at Providence College. So it took me a little while to get the dissertation done, approved, and the dissertation turned out to be Rhode Island's constitutional development and eventually democracy in decline.
Oh, that's cool.
And so in 1970, I got the doctorate, and by that time, I've been teaching at Providence College for 7 years.
So then when did you start writing history books?
I started writing history, doing research of quality at the master's level.
Okay.
There was a professor at Notre Dame, a highly ranked professor, one of the leading national authorities on the early national period. His name was Marshall Smeltzer, and he kind of guided me as to proper research techniques and scholarly writing. And I did an essay for him at the master's level. He was doing a book in the New American Nation series on the period of the 1790s through the War of 1812, and he wanted to see if the traditional view of James Madison as a weak and indecisive president was correct, because that was the projection of the Federalists, his political opponents. And I did an analysis of Madison and his relationship with Congress and his leadership as commander-in-chief during the War of 1812. It was a very long, 150-page analysis, and it was a kind of a vindication of Madison, which Smeltzer was sufficiently impressed with, that his view of Madison in his New American Nation series volume was based in large measure upon my assessment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. So what was the first book you wrote then? Was it Democracy in Decline?
Well, in a way, if you would say, well, the completed project was it was accepted in 1969, and I graduated in 1970, but before that book was published by the Rhode Island Historical Society in 1977, I was working as the historian for the Diocese of Providence. Bishop Dan Riley, who was not then bishop but the chancellor, had asked me and Mattie Smith to do a history of Catholicism in Rhode Island. And so we worked on that, and in 1976, when I was chairman of the State Bicentennial Commission, I was able to get the funds through the commission to publish the book. So Catholicism in Rhode Island, the Formative Era, which was very highly reviewed, was the first book, and Democracy in Decline came out the year after.
I see. So when did you become like a well-known name in the Rhode Island history community? Because I feel like you had become the historian laureate later on in your career, but when did it really start where people knew you as a well-known and respected Rhode Island historian?
The key was the bicentennial. Back in 1969, George McDonald, state legislator, proposed that a bicentennial commission be created to prepare for Rhode Island's celebration of observance of 200 years of independence. And I was very well politically connected at that time. I was a principal speechwriter back then for Governor Frank Leach.
Okay.
And then I became a principal advisor to Governor Philip Noel, and then to Governor Joseph Garrahy, and also to Congressman Robert O. Tiernan. I was his special assistant and on the congressional payroll. So I used that influence to become the vice chairman of the Bicentennial Commission, and because the legislator that introduces the legislation for a commission becomes the chairman. Unfortunately for George McDonald, he got into a little problem selling taking money, bribery in essence, for commemorative items. And so the vacancy occurred in 1974, And Phil Noel, with whom I was quite close and remained close, appointed me the chairman of RI 76. So RI 76 then immediately involved me in all aspects of Rhode Island history, not only just the American Revolutionary era, but the history of Rhode Island leading up to the Revolution to establish the type of colony and state that we were. And that was a highly successful celebration. And as a matter of fact, at the end of 1976, the Bicentennial Commission got the National Award from the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration as the best conducted, most comprehensive bicentennial celebration of any state in the Union.
Wow!
And
nice.
I was very much involved in, in the tall ships and in the parades, and what I did as chairman to bring as much popular participation in the celebration was to create committees. And I created, between committees and their subcommittees, 52 of them, recruiting over 1,200 additional people to the 25 bicentennial commissioners that I inherited. So I created an ethnic heritage program and appointed 18 subcommittees: the Irish Committee, the Italians, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the French, the Italian, on and on, and then charged each one of those groups to write so that they'd feel a part, and it's not just a celebration for the old line Yankees, so they'd feel a part of the American development.
Yeah.
And so, which I'll give you the set today, a box set of the ethnic heritage pamphlets that were produced, and I edited those.
Okay.
And so
Thank you.
I became proficient in the history of every one of those ethnic groups by
cool.
virtue of working with them. I was an athlete, so I formed a sports committee, and we had 11 subcommittees, one on baseball, one on softball, and we created the RI 76 senior softball team that barnstormed the state and played over 90 games, raising money for charity and for the commission, and popularizing and advertising the celebration. We had a committee on parades and reenactments, another committee on the tall ships, etc.
Yeah.
So it was, I got into almost every facet of Rhode Island as a result of the chairmanship of the Bicentennial Commission. So that was the key.
Yeah, yeah.
And after that, it just, it just got more intense and even, it's hard to say expanded, but you might say got more even into the modern Rhode Island period, into the 20th century, where earlier historians had pretty much neglected that period of Rhode Island. And so I became very much involved in everything from the foundation right on through the mid to late 20th century.
So you've done obviously a lot in your career. Like, you've written several books, one of them being my favorite, Democracy in Decline. You helped with Amendment or Article 14 in the Rhode Island Constitution with getting that introduced.
I was the secretary of the 1973 Constitutional Convention.
Yep. And then later very recently you were the historian laureate. If you could pick like one accomplishment you're most proud of, what would it be and why?
Well, if I had to look back on it, there were two things that I would recall: the chairmanship of the Bicentennial of Independence and all of the opportunities and exposure that position gave to me.
Yep.
But then in 1987 through 1991, I then became the chairman of the Bicentennial of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Rhode Island statehood. And there had been an organization that was established back by this George MacDonald. I feel so sorry for him that he gave away the opportunity he could have had, but it was called the Bicentennial Council of the 13 original states, and had delegates from each of the original 13. And it stayed in operation after the Bicentennial of Independence, because some states, carried their commissions right through to 1983, whereas Rhode Island stopped its commission in June 30th of 1977. And so I also then became the chairman of the U.S. We changed the name by the late 80s because of your Constitution and Bill of Rights and all. And the Bicentennial Council of the 13 original states became the U.S. Constitution Council, and I became its president. So I would say those two positions, heading up the Bicentennial of Independence and then heading up not just in Rhode Island, but through the original 13 of the Bicentennial of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights would be the highlights of my historical career.
Certainly great accomplishments. I want to dive into like the core part of our discussion today, which is going to look at the history of democracy in Rhode Island.
Yep.
And we're going to talk a lot about the challenges in like the 19th century, the Dorr Rebellion, all of those things that people are well aware of. But I want to start with like the highlights and when Rhode Island was more of a radical democracy rather than being so radically anti-democratic.
Yep.
So one of the things I find really neat is that in the mid-1600s, shortly after Rhode Island's founding, the Rhode Island government comes out and says, we're a democracy. We are led by a majority of the people, which is like an incredibly unique thing for its time. So can you expand on why a government coming out in the mid-1600s and calling itself a democracy was such a radical thing for the time?
Well, it was radical because during the course of the 17th century, Western civilization was governed by the divine right of kings, and there was royalty, there was aristocracy, and then basically the peasantry with really no say or control over the policies of the nation state that they were in which they lived. And so democracy was a big leap away from the situation that prevailed in Europe at the time, and the type of government that we would call monarchy, with a second layer of aristocracy. And the reason I think that Rhode Island took that jump was for religious reasons, because of the desire for religious liberty and separation of church and state, so that the monarch would not determine the religion of the subjects. So in other words, in Rhode Island, you have individuals coming here who wish to practice their religion, have what Williams called soul liberty, and not have their religious beliefs dictated to them by a king or by some ruler that was above them. And so I think that the religious liberty aspect and the separation of church and state, those principles where Roger Williams and John Clark and others established Rhode Island, lent itself to much greater individual control, not only of their religious beliefs, but kind of spilling over to a certain degree into their political activities as well. And so they got a charter in 1663 from the king, Charles II, that established Rhode Island's corporate existence, its legal right to exist, based upon religious liberty and separation of church and state, but also based upon the fact that it would not be a royal colony, and it would not be a proprietary colony like all of the others. It would be a corporate colony like Connecticut, but with Connecticut, Congregationalism tended to be predominant and enforced, whereas in Rhode Island it wasn't. And so that charter allowed the people, created a General Assembly, which was pretty much all powerful, and the General Assembly could decide who the freemen of that colony were. They made a determination that land, the ownership of land, would be the major qualification for freemanship, and the freemen would elect the General Assembly. They would elect the governor, the general officers, whereas in the other colonies, your governor is either it's royal, appointed by the crown, or selected by the proprietor. And so the form of government in that charter and the basis for that charter having such a form created Rhode Island, as a pioneering democracy here in the New World.
Got it. And then it remained extremely democratic up until the American Revolution. I think Gordon Wood has mentioned how, like, of all the British colonies, Rhode Island was the most democratic for a number of reasons. And we think back on that, like, to us, that's something that's cool, that's something to admire. But the founding fathers didn't love Rhode Island's democratic ways. Can you expand on why they had some issues with our radical democracy?
Well, because the founding fathers were more conservative politically than your Rhode Island leaders for the most part. Rhode Island, there were several individuals that visited Rhode Island in the 1860s, early 70s, before the Revolution, and they disparagingly, one called it a downright democracy, and others talked about how the people have rights far exceeding that in any of your other colonies. So the British brought that view of Rhode Island, British visitors, back to the motherland, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so, as you pointed out correctly, Rhode Island, and Gordon Wood as well, who's a good friend, pointed out correctly that Rhode Island was clearly the most democratic. It appointed all of its state officials, the judges, the General Assembly, the governor, and a host of other officers appointed directly by the people. You've got religious liberty, you've got separation of church and state, and so it is right to the time of the Revolution of Democracy. But of course, my book says, well, but democracy in decline.
Yeah.
Because with the coming of industrialization, which brought urbanization, Rhode Island began to change markedly, and now you've got individuals who are no longer freeholders because something that would be natural in an agricultural economy, an agricultural society, and Rhode Island is a leader again. It's a leader in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution tends to change its nature from the agricultural type of entity that it was all through the colonial period to one that was more mercantile, one that was more industrial, and if you're developing industry, you need a workforce. So you get individuals coming in, but they're landless, and so you get a large group of residents that do not have land, hence they're not freemen, hence they're lacking the right to vote, and several other perks that go along with freemanship.
Yeah.
And they start to look and see, particularly during the Jacksonian era, the age of the common man, that now Rhode Island's lagging behind some of the other states because they when Virginia abandoned a real estate requirement in the late 1820s, Rhode Island became the only state now to have a real estate requirement for voting and holding office.
Yep.
And so it went from a democracy, clearly one in the 1760s and 1770s and 80s, to one where a smaller and smaller percentage of its residents exercise political power and influence.
Yeah.
So hence democracy in decline. That's why I chose that particular title for the book.
And I think it's really well put because it is such like a high point in world history when it comes to democracy. Rhode Island in the 18th and 17th century being this like radical little colony, and then it drops off and becomes the least democratic state in America. So
Yeah.
it's definitely like a massive decline. Can you expand a little bit more on why those in power saw Rhode Island's democracy declining, saw suffrage being taken away from so many people, and they chose to keep the status quo and keep the charter? What were the things driving them that wanted to keep the charter in place rather than a more modern government?
Power.
Yeah.
They control the state under the existing charter system.
And who is they, if you can?
They would be your landholders.
Yep.
And the individuals that acquired even wealth beyond mere land. They were the entrepreneurs and all.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is you don't want to allow what they might look upon as the great unwashed or rabble or whatever to be on the same level as them as far as political power and influence would be concerned.
Yeah.
So in other words, they didn't want to share the power. They had the power, and some type of a significant change in the structure of government would diminish their power and greatly increase the power of the workforce, the laborers that were pouring into the state as industry grew.
Yeah.
And the one thing in Rhode Island which was neglected by earlier historians, which I pointed out and thought it was the major new insight of democracy in decline, was the religious nature of nativism. That, in other words, this workforce that was coming in from the War of 1812 onward and through the 1840s and 50s and 60s, mainly Irish Catholics.
Yep.
And they were coming in very significant numbers to get to the point where the Irish become, by the 1880s, your largest ethno-cultural group. And so they were not only looked down on from the point of view that they're, just of the laboring class, so to speak, and relatively uneducated, but because they, the natives, felt that your Irish Catholics could not be assimilated because they owed their allegiance to a foreign potentate, to the Pope of Rome, and therefore could never be good Americans.
Yeah.
And so your religious, in the Dorr Rebellion, for example, the principal weapon used by the so-called law and order faction, those that were in control of the government, was political nativism directed at the Catholic Irish.
Yeah. And so you mentioned something interesting there, and something I've never really understood, to be honest, where the southern landholders in Rhode Island who held all the power and they wanted to defend the charter government so they didn't lose that power.
Yeah.
They were also a majority of them, of the Democratic Party, if I remember correctly. And yet,
yeah, back in the period of Jefferson.
Yeah, but
they were Jeffersonian.
But doesn't that mean, in that area, to be a Democrat, didn't it mean to extend suffrage to a larger percentage of the adult white male population? So I don't really get how they ended up being part of that political party.
All right, well, the basic, you've got to go back. Those are old line natives there, and they have no problem extending the suffrage to those like them that are owners of real estate.
Okay.
What they see, however, in the 1820s and 30s and 40s as a horde of Irish Catholics coming in and inhabiting these industrial areas, particularly in the Blackstone Valley and the Patuxent Valley, and those individuals, by their sheer number, should you do away with the real estate requirement, are going to end up running the state.
Yeah, okay.
And also, there's a fixed system of apportionment.
Yeah.
So every city and town, regardless, of course there were no cities until, well, Newport was for a while in the 1780s, and then that was relinquished. Providence in 1832. But let's say every municipality, regardless of its population, had either 6 for Newport, 4 for the 3 other original towns, Providence, Portsmouth, and Warwick, and then just 2 for the others. Mm-hmm. And some of those municipalities with 2 had become densely populated, urbanized, industrialized. In other words, had a socioeconomic difference between them and the rural towns, and they wanted greater representation, but the charter had fixed the apportionment, and that was a thing that bothered them, that you do away with the charter and these towns are going to dominate, and the rural towns with the good old yeoman farmers of in Jeffersonian mythology are going to be not only outvoted, but they're going to be outrepresented as well. You go to that's why later on, after the one of the concessions to those rural folk was that in the Constitution that was drafted in late 1842 after the so-called rebellion was put down, and which became the basic law of the state, you had a fixed representation in the Senate. So the Senate kind of gave to the rural area a check or a veto on a runaway government dominated by ethnics, so to speak, and mechanics and workmen and what have you that lived in the more populous municipalities. As a matter of fact, there was a congressman, Congdon, in the 20th century that talked about the state senate was a body governed that runs the state, governed by the abandoned farms of Rhode Island. And you had a situation in 1920, say, for example, before the Democrats got in and started and pushed for reapportionment, which they only got in a very limited way till the U.S. Supreme Court mandated it in the 1960s. But you had a situation where in 1920, Providence had a population of approximately 200, in 1925, 268,000, and West Greenwich had a population of 350. And they both had one senator.
It's ridiculous.
So in other words, you get a situation where the farmers, through that Constitution, kept a check. And so, not only were they worried about losing that check in the 1820s and 30s, and at the time of the drafting of the of the Constitution of 1843, but they made sure that there was some guarantee, like today the Senate with that filibuster. They got the, you know what I mean? If it was just a straight out vote, the Republicans would push everything through, but with that filibuster in the Senate, there are certain things, particularly of a financial nature, and this shutdown and everything else, that you need the 60 votes. And so it's like kind of a minority check there. So we've always you've had a situation, and it's a funny thing because those towns became the Republican Party as it formed in the aftermath of the Dorr Rebellion, kind of embraced that system, and thereby won the allegiance of all those rural towns that had in the 1800, 1810, 20, 30 been Democratic. And the Republicans, maintained that senatorial system, and hence the farmers of South County were rock-ribbed Republicans.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to go back to is before Rhode Island adopted a constitution and we still were working off of the charter government, a statement and like an idea that like Dorr and Seth Luther and George Burrell make is that if a government is not democratic or is not a republic, then the people have a right to get rid of that government and create a new one that is democratic or republic. Is that something that was only being discussed in Rhode Island because of what was going on, or was there a bigger national discussion going on about that idea?
That's called, that theory is called popular constituent sovereignty. And basically, it's more identified with Rhode Island and the Dorr Rebellion than any other episode in 18th century or 19th century, what shall I say, any other episode in 19th century America. The Dorrites, likened what they were doing to the action of some of the American revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And, well, you might have gotten some support for that position from Patrick Henry or Sam Adams.
Yeah.
But you certainly wouldn't have gotten it from Washington or Alexander Hamilton or John Adams.
The more Federalists.
There would be more, that it was kind of you might say, a very politically radical position that would have, I think, made American government, and particularly at the state level, much more unstable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't subscribe to that doctrine of popular constituent sovereignty. I can see where individuals could get tremendously frustrated, but I think you've got to effect the change within the existing system and not cast it aside.
Okay, so that leads me to an interesting question that I ponder a lot at times is, if we think about breaking up the Dorr Rebellion into like 3 different phases, there's sort of the precursor, which is Dorr attempting to alter the state government via legal means.
Through a constitutional convention.
And then there's the extra legal political action where the people come together and create their own government under the people's constitution and elect leaders. And then there's the forceful action where Dorr and the Dorrites try to defend that government with force and attack at the state arsenal and everything. I think most people would say the last part they don't agree with too far. The first part they agree with. It's the legal actions you typically take. But based on what you're saying, it sounds like that middle part is also something that you wouldn't necessarily agree with because it's the people bypassing their state legislator.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, yeah. I think it's an interesting question because then if you think about it from the other point of view, like the people are sort of stuck in this non-democratic government and ruled by people who have no desire to change it. So it's like it almost was never going to change if there wasn't some radical action taken by Thomas Wilson Dorr and the people.
Yeah. No, that's like I say, the first part I agree with and support. The second part I totally understand. The resort to violence, but would not support it if I were there at the time. You had a lot of individuals who were like Elijah R. Potter Jr., who proved to be, although a Republican, very much, you might say, progressive in his thought, liberal and democratic in his outlook, but he held back at the time of the rebellion and wrote out against it. In other words, the part that I'm talking about of ignoring the existing government and having your own convention and things of that type. I think that's carrying it too far. It creates instability in the body politic.
Yeah.
For example, you could say that, some people look at maybe Democrats in West Virginia or Republicans in New York City.
Yeah,
You know, we have mobility here in America.
Yeah.
And you know, if you don't if you don't like the situation that you're in, particularly in America with the federal system, you got places to go.
Interesting.
And people are going amazingly. They'll look at California and the number of individuals that are getting their U-Haulers and heading out. You know?
Yeah.
So that's probably the most practical and peaceful solution.
Yeah. So, well, here's another question for you then. And I don't typically love like what if history questions and speculating things that didn't happen. But let's say the Dorr Rebellion never happened and the people did try to go through the standard modes of government to adopt a modern constitution. How long do you think it would have taken for Rhode Island to get rid of the charter and adopt a constitution?
I think within a generation or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Certainly by the time that the Civil War came about, because that would have been a unifying factor and created a whole different milieu in the North as far as the Union was concerned.
Yeah.
And when you get your Irish coming in and everything and contributing to the preservation of the Union as they did during the course of the Civil War, with your various Irish regiments and all of that fighting for the preservation of the Union. Hey, wait a minute, maybe these guys aren't so bad after all. You know?
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, there were a number of attempts made to do away with the real estate requirement that had been inserted in the Law and Order Constitution for naturalized citizens as a result of the role that the Irish played during the Civil War. So it's hard to say, well, what might have, but I think, you know, over a period of time, those restrictions and, you know, especially things like the apportionment and all would have, there would have been attempts to make them less repressive.
So staying on the Dorr Rebellion for another minute then, when you think back to like the January, February of 1842, I see that as like the high point for Thomas Wilson Dorr, where the People's Constitution just got ratified. In I think like a month or two, they're going to actually elect leaders into their new government, which is crazy, by the way, that there were like two governments functioning in Rhode Island. But anyway, at that point, like, do you think there was ever actually a chance that the standing government would allow the People's Constitution to come into play and be the actual new law of Rhode Island?
No.
Okay.
No, because that would have removed them from the seat of power, and they had control of the government. So what they did was pass the Algerine Act, saying if you're going to try to establish a government under the People's Constitution, despite a vote of 13,944 to 51, which we boycotted. If you're going to do that, then you're committing treason against the state. And if Dorr prevails with his constitution, no real estate requirement for naturalized citizens, and also a much more, you might say, accurate reapportionment system. Which it would go in under the People's Constitution. That particular thing worried, farmers, for example. The South County folk, and so and then of course they were afraid that if Dorr attempted to put his government in by force, so they went to Washington, to Tyler, to get his pledge to intervene with militia, Connecticut militia and Massachusetts militia, or federal troops if there was a forceful attempt. So I mean, they took various steps right away. They counterattack, so to speak. So Dorr reaches a peak, and then and then there's the pushback. And of course, also, one of the key things about the pushback is that Constitutional Convention that was doing nothing in November now comes around and says, okay, we'll do away with the real estate requirement for voting for Native citizens. So now you got Native citizens, oh shit, we got the right to vote, well, this agitation worked.
Yeah.
We're not going to go any further. We're not going to put our ass on the line for these Irish Catholics that are coming in.
Yep.
And so they back off.
Yeah.
So the law and order counterattack was tremendously successful.
Yes. I thought that was I love that part of your book, Democracy in Decline, where it showed how odd it was that the Dorrites said, we'll give you all until May to allow our government come into play. And then the Law and Order Party was like, all right, we'll just have this counterattack.
Thanks. Counterattack,
So, all right, if you think about the People's Constitution that was ratified in 1841, I think December of 1841, it was created and ratified in a radical way. Part of the Constitution where it said if the government is not democratic, the people have a right to alter that government is a radical. But was there anything actually radical about the People's Constitution for its time outside of those two things?
outside of the manner in which that they proposed to put it into effect, and the doctrine of popular constituent sovereignty. No, as a matter of fact, it helped to remove the court somewhat from General Assembly control. It provided for a more fair apportionment of the General Assembly. It broadened the suffrage. It made education, and that's about the only thing in the People's Constitution that has not come to pass here in Rhode Island. All of the other things that Dorr proposed were eventually added to the Constitution by amendment. The last amendment was mine in 1973, where there's a procedure for the regular call of constitutional conventions at the behest of the people. But the one thing that Dorr had in the People's Constitution has not been enacted, I think that would be admirable, was that education as a basic constitutional right.
Oh, interesting.
That was in the Dorr Constitution. Of course, Dorr was very active with education reform.
Yeah.
And when he was a member of the Providence School Committee, instrumental in the teachers' exams, instrumental in the establishment of the first secondary school, which evolved into Hope High School. Yeah. All that was Dorr.
Okay, yeah.
And so that's the only thing that hasn't happened. There's been an attempt made in the last 3 or 4 years to put that on the ballot.
Yeah.
But everything else, as I say in some of my writings, that everything else he proposed has been enacted into the basic law of Rhode Island. So that the People's Constitution, other than those two points you mentioned, has been vindicated. So
you mentioned something there, and you touched on it very quickly, but I think it's a really interesting point that is somewhat overlooked in the Dorr Rebellion and Rhode Island's constitutional development, is separating the judicial branch from the General Assembly and the legislative branch. Can you explain exactly how it was before and how making that change was an important step forward for Rhode Island?
Well, before the judiciary was appointed by the legislature.
Yep.
Prior to the Dorr Rebellion, there was just a question of the appointment of the judiciary, and judges could be removed. They served only for a year, and then they had to be at certain points, and then for a couple of years, but they were term limited, and if their decisions weren't in accord with the legislative majority, then they would be replaced. And so they were totally subservient to the General Assembly. With the new constitutional order, they were granted tenure.
Yeah.
So they were still appointed by a vote of the Grand Committee.
Yep.
But got tenure, and certain other, you might say, procedural powers that did not exist when they were totally a creature of the General Assembly, prior to 1843.
Yeah, got it.
But I'm not, the funny thing is, in 1993, Constitution is amended to allow for a judicial nominating commission. And the judicial nominating commission screens and presents to the governor for appointment.
Oh.
And I don't know if from the caliber of the Supreme Court justices, and I say this from a lawyer that's got a number of arguments before the Supreme Court under my belt, that I don't see an appreciable improvement in the caliber, in fact, even a slight decline in the caliber of the Supreme Court justices under that new system.
Interesting. So here's another question I ponder a lot. I think, without Thomas Wilson Dorr, it would take Rhode Island a long time to adopt a modern constitution. Maybe it's around the time of the Civil War, as you were mentioning. So I think what he did there is very heroic in making that push to modernize Rhode Island's government. At the same time, he did become violent, where he attacked the state arsenal, and so there's kind of a villain to him in that sense.
Yeah,
so
New Yorkers stirred him up, I think. Big Mike Walsh and Tammany Hall and some of the others with, promises of support. And I think in the heat of the moment, he reason gave way to.
And I actually spoke with Dr. Chaput yesterday, and he was saying the same thing. He was like, there's no indication that Dorr went into his rebellion and planned to be violent. It was just that it sort of happened, and he was encouraged.
It evolved.
But either way, he did become violent. So when you think about Thomas Wilson Dorr as a Rhode Island historical figure, do you think of him more as a hero or as a villain?
Oh, a hero.
Yeah.
Right up on my wall there.
Nice.
No, everybody, makes mistakes.
Yeah.
Myself especially, and I think he got caught up in the heat of the moment. I think after the meeting with Tyler, he was somewhat chastened, but then stops in New York and gets caught up in the hoopla of Tammany Hall and some of frankly, the wild Irish Democrats there, and then comes back to Rhode Island and 1,200 people cheering them, many of them who were armed. And he said, well, maybe this is the way.
Yeah. You sort of touched on this before, so I think I know your answer, but I'm curious to hear it from you, specifically to the question. What do you think the founding fathers would have thought about Thomas Wilson Dorr and the Dorr Rebellion?
Well, some of the founding fathers would have admired his course of action. As I mentioned to you, a guy like Sam Adams.
Yeah.
A guy like Patrick Henry.
Probably Jefferson.
But your founding fathers, they had they were very advanced in some ways, but they had certainly a conservative bent. Take, for example, Hamilton or Adams. And I don't think that that group of founding fathers would have favored the resort to violence or even the bypassing of an existing state government in a rather stable nation committed to federalism.
Yeah, okay. So, all right, if we shift past the Dorr Rebellion now, and we think the Constitution is in place, but it'd be incorrect to think Rhode Island adopted a constitution. We now have all these modern democratic practices like the secret ballot, equal representation. Can you go through like the history from 1843, the Constitution, and then the next like century and a half of Rhode Island adopting modern democratic practices so that people can understand how long it actually took?
Well, it did take a long period of time. Basically, in the aftermath of the Dorr Rebellion, not only in Rhode Island but nationally, particularly over the slavery issue, there was a reorganization of political parties. The Republican Party forms in the 1850s in opposition to the extension of slavery into the territories, but also in opposition to slavery itself as an institution. And it garnered a considerable amount of support in the North. It absorbed the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party. There were national third parties, as we call them. They absorbed pretty much the Whig Party and its commercial and mercantile and financial positions. And here in Rhode Island, it also embraced the nativism of the law and order Constitution with regard to Irish Catholics, because one of the founders of the party, Henry Bowen Anthony, editor of the Journal, was one of the most rabid anti-Irish Catholic nativists in America, if not the most. And so his views and his newspaper and all tended to shape the outlook of the Republican Party that sent your Irish scurrying to the Democratic Party and looking to at Dorr, what Dorr had attempted in the People's Constitution. So I think the Dorr Rebellion in Dorr led to the Irish, which become the dominant ethnic group by the end of the 19th century, led them to strongly embrace the Democratic Party. So you get a situation where you have a party realignment, but the Republicans, drawing at that time on the Native American vote, including the farm vote, because of the desire of the farmers to keep that veto power through the rotten borough Senate. The Republicans pretty well dominate from their inception all the way down until the so-called New Deal. And what they do when other groups start coming in, they have no problem with the Swedes, because the Swedes are Protestant. The Germans are a mixed bag, but mainly it's Protestant as opposed to Catholic Germans. There's actually no German national parish ever established in Rhode Island. But then when the French start coming in during the Civil War and thereafter to man the mills and the expansion of the textile industry, and then when your Italians come in, and later in the turn of this, those are the two major groups. What the Republican Party does is stress they're the party of the full dinner pail. They're the party that runs the mills and owns the mills. The Republicans are the mill owners. They're the party of industrialization. And what they do, of course, the Irish, not being as astute as they have been credited with being, they show some of their own antagonism towards the French and towards the Italians. Even though they're fellow Catholics, they look at them as kind of rivals for jobs, moving into the Irish neighborhoods. Some of the Catholic traditions of the French and namely the Italians were with the processions and all of that stuff were looked down upon by the Irish. Some of the territorial parishes, which was started by the Irish and the diocese headed by Irish bishops, you have a situation where sometimes, particularly with the Italians in and around Providence, you guys worship down in the basement, and us Irish will stay upstairs. And so the Irish did not cultivate these groups stupidly. And they tended to gravitate towards the Republican Party.
Interesting.
And that allowed the Republican Party to prevail. But what happened after the turn of the century, particularly you get into the period of the 1920s, the textile industry starts to decline or move south. You got unemployment amongst the Franco-Americans. You've got Republicans taken up with 100% Americanism in the aftermath of World War I, and therefore attacking the use of the French language in schools, passing the so-called Peck Act. So you've got a situation where the Republican, and of course through immigration, through the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, particularly hitting Italians there and Portuguese, they start to restrict the volume of migration from southern Europe and the Mediterranean through the quota system. So you get a situation where with the decline in industry and joblessness and the Republicans embracing this 100% Americanism and anti-immigration position, that you get a movement of the French and the Italians, because the Portuguese are kind of not a big political factor. They weren't so much interested in the politics, but the French and the Italians were. And you get them switching over during the 1920s to the Democratic Party because the Irish finally smartened up and started offering the Italians like Luigi di Pasquale or the French like Alberic Archibald and Felix Turpin. Started to offer them positions. Giano Pastore with the Italians, positions within the Democratic Party, positions of leadership. And so these groups come over by the 1930s, by the mid-30s, and particularly with the Republicans in power and the great, not that Hoover caused it, but a lot of the Republican economic policies of the 20s helped to bring about the great crash and then the Great Depression, and the Democrats come in more with the government coming in with assistance and handouts, whereas the Republicans, like under Hoover, more laissez-faire, so you're on your own, that kind of thing, and it brings the ethnics. And I have a book, which I'll give it to you before you leave, where I discuss all of that and the role of Robert Emmett Quinn, Irish leader, in affecting that transformation of the Italians and the Franco-Americans into the Democratic Party, and establishing, therefore, for the duration of the century, a Democratic dominance, which actually continues in Rhode Island to the present time.
Yeah. So a few more questions for you before we wrap up. I'll sometimes go back and listen to some of the older podcast episodes I created 2 or 3 years ago, and listen to them and see what I can learn from what I could have done differently, or how I could have made the episode more effective or told the story better. And I notice sometimes I'll listen to them and I have new information, and I'll even think about the story a bit differently than when I first wrote it. Do you ever look back on some of the books that you wrote, like maybe Democracy in Decline or anything, and have a shift in perspective on it now that it's been a number of years since you wrote it?
Well, the only thing that I'm very satisfied with that book.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Christian McBurney and some historians associated with him with that Rhode Island blog call it the finest book on Rhode Island history. So you don't argue with success.
Yeah.
But I probably the title is a little it's a little too modest, because my doctoral dissertation was Rhode Island Constitutional Development 1636 to 1941. I mean 1841, and I did that because I wanted to get the dissertation done. I didn't want to bring the Dorr Rebellion and drag this thing out with working 3 jobs and got 4 kids and all kinds of other things. So I Smeltzer said you can start it, stop it at 1841 to show the factors leading up to the rebellion. But when I came out with the book during the early 70s, I put an epilogue in. And the epilogue not only covered the Dorr Rebellion, but the aftermath down to the 1850s to Dorr's death and the reorganization of political parties. And so Democracy in Decline is broader than that subtitle suggests. And I should have done Rhode Island Constitutional Development 1636, 1854.
Yeah, that's true, because like when you see the title, you do think it'll mainly be about Rhode Island going from like so democratic, so anti-democratic. But in preparing for this interview, I was rereading that book, and I was like, it really does outline the century after when Rhode Island adopted modern democratic practices. So I definitely think that's fair. Are there certain like Rhode Island historians or Rhode Island history books that you're most fond of?
Well, I would say I admire Charles Carroll, a pioneering historian, Irish Catholic, that kind of included a much more diverse and broader analysis of Rhode Island history than some of the earlier ones like an Arnold or a Bicknell. So I admire Charles Carroll, who was an educator and director of the State Department of Education way back in the 1920s. As far as a multi-volume history is concerned, as far as other works, I think Eric Chappett did a fine job with his biography of Thomas Wilson Dorr. My only thing, and I try to tone him down on this, was he became very enamored of black history and an authority on it, and became somewhat disillusioned with Dorr in a position in the 1850s where he kind of backed off a little, certainly from abolitionism, because Dorr felt that a real belligerent approach as taken by the radical abolitionists would push the South into disunion. And Dorr favored union and get rid of slavery gradually without a conflict between the free states and the slave states. And he's a little critical of that he backed away. But if you look at Abraham Lincoln in 1854, Abraham Lincoln and Dorr are pretty much the same with regard to slavery and the preservation of the Union and things of that type. So I try to tell him, I said, Lincoln's a great emancipator, but look at his writings and things in 1854 at the year that Dorr died. I said, you'd be a little bit more tolerant of Dorr's more moderate position. And I think some of the balls to the wall type actions of the abolitionists, maybe Dorr in his mind thought about May and June of 1842. You see, so maybe a little restraint here would be in order.
It makes you think of it's almost like a sure thing how much Dorr's views would have went back to his older views on abolitionism as the Civil War came about if he would have lived that long. It seems like he definitely would have jumped on board for abolition of slaves and everything.
No question then. But once the war was upon it, but he was concerned with the threat to union by the the real rabid abolitionists.
Yeah.
And indeed, he was correct.
Yeah. What's one part of Rhode Island history, or any part of history really, that you want to better understand?
Well, I certainly don't understand completely any part of it, but I think I have enough of a grasp of it at 87, and with the writing that I've done, that that satisfies me.
What do you mean by that? There's no part of it you completely understand.
Well, I mean, if you don't live through it,
Yeah.
you know only through research and maybe from what other historians have written. So the view of the historian can be probably at best approximate as opposed to definitive in many instances when covering a broad range of things or a number of individual participants.
Have there been certain positions you've had on history that have changed recently?
Not on Rhode Island history, no.
Any like American history area views that have changed?
Well, with American history, because I haven't taught that since about 1993. You know, I'm not particularly fond of that 1619 theory, which I think is preposterous and presentistic. But I don't see that amongst scholars and knowledgeable historians becoming the dominant view.
Yeah.
But some of the 1619 project and its progeny, that I find to be absolutely presentistic and inaccurate. I'll be giving you a book at the end of this where I've written a critique of it as it pertained to the Gaspee, because there was an individual that said that the Gaspee raiders were motivated
by slavery,
to create a break with England, because England was about to ban the slave trade, and as a colony, the slave trade would be banned here, and I deal with that in great detail and show how that was no factor whatsoever.
Why is it important to avoid presentism when writing and looking back at history?
Because you're judging the past by the standards of the present.
Yeah.
You've got to judge historical actors, historical individuals by the times in which they lived. That doesn't mean that necessarily you give them, you say, well, that was moral, but it was something that was generally accepted, and to denounce someone who embraced the spirit of the time, I think is, like I say, and to apply present standards of politics or governance or morality to them is and condemn them for not meeting the standards of the present, I think is an unfair view.
Yeah. All right, last question for you. If you could go back to one point in Rhode Island history, what point would you go back to and why?
The point that I was in the middle of developing, along with my wife, the Allens Avenue waterfront along in Providence back in a period from 2006 through 2013. I called it Providence's era of Camelot. If it hadn't been for political corruption, that waterfront, instead of being the Scrapulation Trail, would have been beautifully developed with hotels and restaurants and ancillary medical facilities and cruise ships and all of the other things. So I deeply resent that. That could have been a turning point in the history of Providence and Rhode Island, and it was squandered. I'll give you a copy of my book, and you can read it, and you'll see.
Yeah, I know absolutely nothing about what you just mentioned there.
When you see it, you'll say, my God, because it was the biggest economic, you might say, blunder that I can recall in all of Rhode Island history, denying the rezoning of that Providence waterfront so as to allow its development.
That's so cool that you named a period of Rhode Island history that you lived through and were a part of.
And it was very much a part of that. We only lost $5.3 million, my wife and I.
Dang.
But just a mere pittance.
Yeah. All right. I said that was the last question, but I'll give you one more because we have a few minutes left. Why should Rhode Islanders be proud of the history of their state?
Why should they what?
Why should Rhode Islanders be proud of the history of their state?
Well, I think they could be especially proud of our role in the formative era. And there's a booklet that I'm going to give you, Rhode Island's Contributions to the Formation of the United States.
Nice.
And with the religious liberty, church-state separation, democracy, the origins of the party system, the founding of the United States Navy, our role in the War for Independence, the opening of global maritime trade, and the establishment of the Industrial Revolution. All of these are covered briefly in this.
Beautiful.
And I hope it becomes a reader for those that are celebrating the 250th, because it's a remarkable achievement.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well said. Thank you so much for your time today. This was an awesome experience for me, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
And while you're here, I told you the Rhode Island Publications Society also operates here. We operate downstairs. So I want you to come down and pick out some books for your library.
Thank you.
From our collections.
Thank
and
you.
I've done 5 anthologies, and so any of those that you don't have, you can add to the total of about 260 essays cumulatively in those anthologies. And so the one thing I can guarantee you that it will cure your insomnia.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.